context about what the Black founders we've been learning about were up against. So I am going to include in Tuesday's folder this annotated version of Eddie Glaude's chapter, Religion and Violence in Black and White. And the argument in the chapter is that African Americans have faced a specific kind of violence and exclusion from the definition of what it means to be American since the founding of the United States and even before. And one of the tactics or problem solving strategies that Black leaders used to address that problem was to flip the script of the religious narrative. So that basically means that the Puritan ideal of the United States as a promised land and as Americans as the chosen people was relevant to, obviously, the European settlers and the European Americans who became citizens of the United States. And the religious background that the United States still, I think, holds very close is the idea that there's a covenant with God, that this great country that we have comes from a covenant and an agreement to uphold a moral life and also a democratic life. However, when the United States was founded, the 13 colonies that were beholden to Great Britain were heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade because England was the leading country involved in the slave trade. And as we saw in Notes on Virginia, one of the founders, Thomas Jefferson, helped to make the argument that Blacks lacked reason and therefore weren't suited for the moral or democratic life that is part of the covenant that white Americans and what we might call white supremacists had with God in creating the promised land. What Eddie Glaude reminds us of is that transatlantic slavery built the wealth and power of this new United States, but at the same time, I think it'd be difficult to argue against the idea that slavery relied on a regime of violence. And Glaude also mentions the violence enacted against free Blacks who in Charleston or New York City or Boston owned their own businesses and had their own neighborhoods and schools, nonetheless were excluded from American citizenship. And in the anecdote that he opens his essay with, when he talks about the July Day celebrations of 1834, frequently white mobs would attack Black neighborhoods. And in the case of Chatham Street Church in New York City or St. Philip's African Episcopal Church, the charge was that Black people were promoting amalgamation or interracial marriage or a blurring of this really distinct line between Black and white that had become part of America's identity. So David Walker is one of the examples that Glaude talks about. I would say Walker flipped the script of the American Jeremiad and said, actually, the Mosaic covenant with God that the Puritans recreated wasn't really a case of Puritans being chosen people and America being a city on the hill. Rather, the Puritans in the founding of the United States created another Egypt and Israel situation where the evil enslavers who claimed moral authority actually were the source of evil, and the African Americans were God's chosen people and would bring about a true definition of democracy. Now, when Eddie Glaude talks about the truth, he doesn't fully buy into Walker's argument, but he does always argue that it's really important to understand this history of making people of African descent an exception, in a state of exception, excluded from the ideas of Americanness and belonging in this country. So using religious values in the religious narrative to create that exclusion is a white supremacist move, And the Black nationalist response, as Glaude tells us, is often to use the Exodus story in a different incarnation, claiming it for African Americans and making African Americans the chosen people who will fulfill the promise of democracy. So that is the Eddie Glaude article in very few minutes. In blue here, I added some notes that will help you connect some of these ideas to what Glaude is talking about in his interview with Trevor Noah. And I hope that you enjoy all of this new information. Let me know if you have any questions.